So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Women's History Day event, Profoundly Vulnerable, the story of four witchcraft accusations. As always, just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements before we get started. This program is being recorded. It will be posted to our virtual archive after the program is finished. We will be turning off the cameras for the duration of the talk. We will turn it back on at the end for a Q&A, and we will have some time for questions. So if you have questions as we go, you can feel free to put them in the chat. Just know we won't answer them until the very end of the presentation. And without further ado, we will get started.
The name of our lecture today was inspired by a line from John Demos's book, Entertaining Satan, Witchcraft and the Culture of Early New England, in which he ends his chapter about Rachel Hatfield Clinton with the words, "Women like Rachel were fitted to the role of witch, at least in part because they were so profoundly vulnerable." Today we'll be discussing Clinton, followed by Sarah Good, Ann Dolliver, and Margaret Scott. Rachel Clinton's story, like that of other women we will discuss today, is one of a promising beginning, followed by a steady decline into abject poverty and despair. Women who fit this description in 17th century New England were perfect targets for witchcraft accusations, particularly if there was no male figure to defend them. Rachel's father, Richard Hatfield, born circa 1581, was about 54 years old when he sailed from London to the New World with his wife Martha and 5 daughters on the ship the Planter. He was a currier by trade, meaning a man who transformed tanned leather by stretching and finishing it, making it strong, supple, and ready for a cobbler or saddler to create a final product. After arriving in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Hatfields, who had been living in Sudbury, Suffolk, England, settled in Ipswich. The 2 oldest girls, Marie and Sarah, had been born to Richard's first wife, Judith, whose maiden name may have been Watson, and the 3 youngest, Martha, Rachel, and Ruth, to his second wife, Martha Mansfield. Parish records at All Saints Parish Church in Sudbury reveal that Richard's first marriage was a sorrowful one, as Judith, in addition to the 2 daughters who lived to adulthood, also gave birth to 4 sons, 2 of whom lived for only a matter of days, one of whom was stillborn, and one who lived to the age of 15. Judith died in the summer of 1624, and Richard remarried to Martha the following January. Demos writes that Hatfield's initial holdings were well above the average grant for early settlers in Ipswich. Hatfield was granted more than 125 acres, a house lot, 6 acres of planting land, 20 acres of meadow, and 100 acres of unspecified land. The house lot may have been one in Ipswich Center, noted on an early map at the Ipswich Museum, likely abandoned early. Hatfield instead established his homestead in the southeastern part of Ipswich, known as Tobacco Parish by 1679, now called Essex, near the original center of that town. Here a small dam was constructed, creating falls that powered several mills located on the Alewife Brook. His 100 acres were located even farther to the southeast on the Great Salt Marsh. The principal crop harvested there was salt marsh hay. Richard lived only 4 years after the move to Massachusetts, dying in 1639. With an estate valued at more than £500, he left equal portions to his children, approximately £30 to his 2 oldest daughters, and the same amount to the 3 youngest upon their reaching the age of 16. His wife Martha was the executrix. Despite Richard's best effort to divide his substantial estate equally and fairly, Demos points out that the will was still being litigated more than 50 years after his death. The trouble may have been that Martha, mother to the 3 youngest daughters, was known to be harsh with the 2 older stepdaughters. According to Demos, she was very abusive and unreasonable, both in want of necessary apparel and other ways, as also in many hard words and blows. Demos speculates that, being from a poor family and from a lower status than Richard or his first wife, Martha may have been resentful and taken it out on the stepdaughters. Martha never remarried after Richard's death and remained a widow until her own death, close to 30 years later. Martha managed the estate well, however, in the years after her husband's death, conserving the family resources, as Demos notes. She leased some of the land to tenants and spun cloth for sale. Interestingly, there was a bridge constructed over the Castle Neck River in 1659, next to the Hatfield farm in Essex. Then and now it is called Hatfield's Bridge. The two oldest daughters were married by 1645, leaving the home with only Martha and her 3 biological children. The oldest of these, also called Martha, married in 1650. In 1653, the youngest Hatfield, Ruth, was charged with excess of apparel. At the time, one was expected to wear clothing appropriate to one's status. Proving that her mother was worth 200 pounds at the time, the charges against her were dropped. The Hatfields were still considered well off in 1653. The following year, young Ruth also married. Only Rachel remained unwed and living with her mother. It's not clear when the first signs of mental impairment began, but over the years, Rachel's mother, Martha, slowly went insane. Demos notes a court case where Martha was convicted of taking the name of God to witness to a lie, claiming at first that her daughter struck her and then denying that fact. Other incidents of growing confusion are unknown, but by 1655, the town of Ipswich took mercy on the old woman and sold her 4 rods of ground near the mill dam for 12 pence to build a little house on. This lot was located in the center of downtown Ipswich on the river. About a decade after moving with her mother to Ipswich Center, Rachel, now in her mid-30s, began a relationship with Lawrence Clinton, an indentured servant of Ipswich resident Robert Cross. He was scandalously 14 years her junior. As talk of marriage began, Rachel paid 21 pounds to Cross to cover the remaining 3.5 years of Clinton's contract. This payment became the subject of legal disputes over the next several years. Rachel claimed that she had the right to spend her own money. Her brother-in-law, Thomas White, married to younger sister Ruth, claimed otherwise. He believed that Clinton, in cahoots with his former employer Cross, were trying to cheat Rachel and get their hands on her part of the Hatfield inheritance. And pictured here is an early map of Ipswich noting Cross's Ipswich property and a modern photograph of the old center of Essex where Cross may have moved his family. Perhaps White was right about the Hatfield inheritance. On the other hand, it may have been Thomas White himself who was manipulating Rachel and trying to get his hands on Hatfield property. In the spring of 1666, as the widow Hatfield's mental competence declined, the court ordered that rents from the Hatfield farm be collected by White to pay for her maintenance. Months later, Martha was officially declared non-compos mentis, or insane, by the Ipswich authorities. Thomas White was named her guardian. According to Demos, Rachel stated that the small cottage in which she and her mother had lived for years was abruptly sold on White's orders, their household goods confiscated, and Martha was moved to Thomas and Ruth White's home in Wenham. The widow Hatfield lived for less than 2 years, dying in Wenham in 1668. White also apparently cut out the 2 oldest daughters, perhaps with the widow's encouragement, and favored his own wife in the distribution of Hatfield's remaining wealth. And obviously, the beautiful home you see on the property today is nothing like the small structure Rachel and her mother lived in. Where Rachel lived from this point on is unknown. Quoting from her mother's will, which was written 6 years earlier but never probated, Martha left to Rachel, "my dwelling house with all the appurtenances, as also all my household goods unbequeathed." But this contradicts Rachel's own words. Her brother-in-law appears to have taken all or most of her inheritance. And in 1667, In an odd similarity to her mother's earlier legal problems, Rachel was whipped for accusing neighbor John Clark for having relations with her and then denying it. About the time of her mother's death, Rachel petitioned the court, saying she had neither home nor hearth to shelter herself, not so much as from the extremity of the weather, unless by intrusion into Thomas White's family, where she had little welcome. She asked for immediate relief so she would not be forced to wander from house to house like an Indian or brute beast. And what of her marriage to Lawrence Clinton? He had not been a good choice as a trustworthy, loyal, and faithful husband. Rachel herself eventually thought Clinton and Cross may really have been out to dupe her. And throughout the 1670s, Clinton was fined in court for not financially maintaining his wife and, in fact, abandoning her for all intents and purposes. He was convicted of attempting to ravish Mary Knowlton in 1670, of fathering Mary Greeley's son in 1677, and of fornicating with Mary Wooden in 1678, for which he and Mary No. 3 were whipped. Rachel petitioned the court for a divorce. Rachel, meanwhile, was herself in trouble for extramarital relations, imprisoned on suspicion of uncleanness and other evil practices with one John Ford. Lawrence Clinton fathered another child, this time with Mary Wooden, and the couple moved to Rhode Island and married, even though Lawrence was still married to Rachel. After years of petitioning, Rachel was finally granted a divorce. Despite coming from what had once been a significant estate, by this time, Rachel was left impoverished and alone in the world, needing public charity from the town in her later years. The records note 4 instances in 1686 where the town paid for repairs to Rachel's house. Where this house was is unknown, as her brother-in-law, Thomas White, had taken the little house by the river years earlier. Worse was to come. In March of 1692, 63-year-old Rachel became one of the earliest people to be accused during the Salem witch trials, with a warrant issued for her arrest on March 29th. According to records of the Salem witch hunt, the warrant for Rachel Clinton is the first one not to have originated with the authorities who first looked into the Salem village accusations. It is little wonder that she was targeted. Rachel's diminished circumstances had turned her into an angry and sullen beggar who made her neighbors uncomfortable. She had been suspected of witchcraft for at least a decade. Historian Demos points out, in at least 2 instances, her supposed witchcraft stemmed from unsuccessful attempts to beg food and/or drink from neighbors. At her examination, 3 Ipswich neighbors testified against her. Mary Fuller claimed that an argument with Clinton caused a neighbor girl to drop dead. In truth, the girl had only fainted, but it was believed that Rachel's mere presence caused the incident. Thomas Borman testified that years earlier at Sunday meeting, Clinton roughly elbowed 2 parishioners. Borman reported the event to the town selectmen, after which he was troubled by 3 animal apparitions, a dog, a cat, and a turtle, while riding home at night. He blamed Clinton for these spectral appearances. Another episode from a decade earlier was described by William Baker, who claimed Rachel Clinton was able to drain a barrel of its entire contents of beer simply by walking up and down the road near the house of the barrel's owner, with whom she had had an earlier altercation. Rachel never went to trial. She was imprisoned from April 11, 1692, to January 12, 1693, when an unknown person paid her jail fees and she was released from Ipswich prison. Most of her incarceration was spent in Ipswich, although Salem's jailkeeper billed the court for 10 weeks in his prison during the time of Rachel's questioning by the magistrates. She was in shackles for some portion of her imprisonment. Where she lived out the few remaining years of her life is unclear, although local tradition holds she lived in a little hut on Hog Island, today known as Choate Island. On a trip to visit the island a few years ago, One visitor who seemed to have some local knowledge told me that Rachel was allowed to live out her days on land owned by a descendant of John Proctor. When I asked how she could have gotten onto the island, I was advised to drive to the end of Island Road from the mainland in Essex to see how close Choate Island was and what a short distance to row during low tide. However, another local historian, Tom Bettle, who I consider the expert on Choate Island, says there is nothing in the records to confirm Rachel's residence there. Nevertheless, it's tempting to think that the shared trauma of the witch trials connected this poor woman and a member of the Proctor family, both having suffered so much. Rachel's exact death date is not known, but she was deceased by early January 1695. Her burial place is unknown.
Sadly, we can see a close parallel narrative in the story of Sarah Soulart Poole Good, one of the 19 innocents killed in 1692. Like Rachel Clinton, she had been raised by an affluent family with every expectation of a prosperous life. Sarah Soulart was born in Wenham, Massachusetts, circa 1654. Little is known about the background of her parents. Her father, John Soulart, is described in local records as the Frenchman, leaving his origins fairly ambiguous. As is common, all that is known of her mother is that her first name was Elizabeth. Sarah was one of 9 children, likely one of the middle children. At the time of his death, her father's estate totaled £573 13 shillings, a sizable sum for the day. He was well regarded enough to be elected a constable and ran a local tavern which was licensed to draw wine and liquor. It seems Sarah's childhood was comfortable, spent in the ordinary occupations of a young girl in a Puritan colony. But sadly, as she reached late adolescence, the family's fortune changed for the worse. On May 24, 1672, John Soulart committed suicide, death by drowning. In a later description of his verbal will, witnesses recalled hearing John state, "He was often troubled with fainting fits, and do apprehend I have not long to live." In this day and age, suicide was considered a grave sin. Those who committed self-murder, as it was then called, were denied the privilege of being buried in the common burying place of Christians. They were instead to be buried in some common highway, their grave marked by a cartload of stones laid upon the grave as a brand of infamy and as a warning to others to beware of the like damnable practice. As Sarah was 18 at the time of her father's suicide, this event appears to have drastically altered the trajectory of her life. Her mother soon remarried, an unsurprising event given that she still had young children in her care. 7 months after the death of her first husband, Elizabeth Soulart married Ezekiel Woodward. The following year, Woodward was licensed to keep a tavern in Wenham, indicating he took over the family business. While this swift marriage may have enabled short-term support for the family, the match ultimately proved ill-fated for the Soulart children. Though each was granted an inheritance by their late father's will, when the time came to take possession of what was promised, their stepfather proved unwilling to honor their late father's wishes. In 1682, a decade after their father's suicide, the surviving Soulart children wrote a petition informing the court of their stepfather's refusal to give what was owed. Though we cannot know exactly how this impacted Sarah as a young adult, she married at a slightly older age than was common. Perhaps her long-delayed inheritance, combined with an unfriendly stepfather, hindered her marital prospects. Nevertheless, in 1682, Sarah Soulart married Daniel Poole. She was 28 and her new husband 27. Records of Daniel Poole before his marriage are scarce. Though the identities of his parents are unknown, they were presumably very poor. As Daniel was made an indentured apprentice to farmer John Roden of Salem when he was 6 years old. This was a common arrangement at the time, with male children tied to their masters until their 21st birthday. Notably, John Roden's living will indicates a particularly close relationship with his young servant. He stated that he had brought up Daniel from his childhood, being mine by adoption and given me by his natural parents. He went on to say, "Daniel engaged himself by these presents to live with the said Mary, my wife, and to take care of her, and to maintain her, and provide necessaries according to his ability, during the whole term of her natural life." According to this document, Daniel may have served as a kind of caretaker for his master's wife, whom he described as being ancient and both weak and lame. As the Rodens had no children of their own, this must have been very helpful for the family. It was certainly recognized as such, for Roden willed all that he had to his apprentice as one would do for his own son. This included his house, orchard, and land, as well as cattle, mare, swine, and movable goods. Though Sarah and Daniel settled into married life, their union was sadly cut short. By the winter of 1683, Daniel Poole was dead. The exact timing and cause of this young man's demise are unknown, though given the dangers of this period, he may have died from any manner of illness or accident. At just 29 years old, Sarah Poole now faced the harsh realities of life as a young widow. Having been left a small estate, she quickly liquefied her assets, perhaps allowing her to briefly retain a semblance of independence. But unfortunately, this could not last. By June of 1685, her situation had attracted the attention of local authorities, who described Widow Poole as not capable of governing herself, either through extreme foolishness or incomposure of mind, and noted that she exposed herself to hazard and suffering, lodging in barns and outhouses without anything to relieve her necessities. Aware that Sarah had a yet unclaimed inheritance in Wenham, the selectmen requested that someone be appointed to take care of the estate and also have charge of her person, that she be kept in good order, for they thought that the town should not be charged with it so long as she had an estate of her own. The bitter irony, of course, was that the town only acted to force her stepfather to give up her inheritance when she seemed poised to become their financial burden. With little choice but to give herself over to local poor relief, Sarah opted for one of the only vehicles left to a woman in such destitute circumstances: marriage. Exactly when her second marriage occurred is unclear, though she appeared in the Essex County Quarterly Court records noted as the wife of William Good in 1686. Much like Daniel Poole, the background of William Good is fairly mysterious. He was described in local records at times as a weaver and others as a laborer, though his family's financial circumstances suggest he was unsuccessful at both. 3 years after their wedding, Sarah and William were called before the county court to answer for a lingering debt. Having swiftly liquidated her few assets after the death of her first husband, Sarah had failed to pay back the debts after their marriage, including the cost of Daniel Poole's coffin and his burial. William and Sarah were found responsible for debt in the amount of merchantable corn or cattle, and 34 shillings, 4 pence money for cost, with 2 shillings more for this execution. Should William fail to repay the debt now, the court ordered he be arrested and brought to prison until the payment was made. The fact that Sarah's long-sought inheritance was finally transferred from Ezekiel Woodward to William Good just a month before this debt case suggests he knew the property would soon be taken. With no alternative, Sarah gave up her last possession of value and used it to pay this outstanding sum so William might be freed. Poor, with no permanent home, the couple appeared to have relied on charity of others to sustain themselves in the years that followed. Sarah gave birth to her first child in 1688, a daughter whom they named Dorothy. Her second child, whose name is unknown, was born in December of 1691. Sometimes alone and sometimes with Dorothy in tow, Sarah was now forced to resort to going house to house begging to sustain her family, a circumstance drastically different from her promising upbringing as a Solart daughter in Wenham. By now, if not before, she must have been stretched to her breaking point, as her anger, disappointment, and resentment seems to have been entirely unrestrained. Those she encountered described her as spiteful, maliciously bent, and one of a turbulent spirit. Several residents of Salem village would later come forward to attest to the misfortunes they purportedly experienced after a clash with Sarah Good. In just one example, Sarah, William, and 1-year-old Dorothy were taken in by Samuel and Mary Abbey in 1689. The Abbeys claimed to have endured Sarah's tempestuous spirit for as long as they could bear, but ultimately could not suffer her to live in their house any longer. They were forced, they said, for quietness' sake, to turn the Good family out of the house. A year later, when the Abbey family lost 2 cows, William brought the news to his wife, who apparently replied she did not care if the Abbeys lost all the cattle they had, and allegedly called the Abbey children vile names and threatened them often. Though suspicions that the beggar Sarah Good was causing various acts of misfortune were apparently harbored by some she encountered, these stories did not take on a deadly tone until 1692. Unfortunately, when Betty Paris and Abigail Williams fell ill in the winter of 1692, Sarah Good was a particularly vulnerable scapegoat. Not only was she already suspected of malevolent magic by some, but she had recently clashed with Reverend Paris. Though the details are hazy, a subsequent account states Sarah had gone to the parsonage asking for charity, bringing Dorothy with her. Though Dorothy was given something by the minister, Sarah went away muttering in evident displeasure. She later insisted she had simply been thanking Reverend Paris for what he gave her child, or was perhaps reciting a psalm. The minister, however, had a different impression of their encounter. When Betty Paris and Abigail Williams named Sarah Good as one of their tormentors, it was all too easy for those around them to believe she was indeed a witch concealed in their community. As she had an infant child no more than 3 months old, she brought the baby with her when the constable arrived with her arrest warrant in hand. This child would remain with Sarah through her subsequent incarceration, dying in Boston prison at some point between April and July of 1692. To add to the horror of imprisonment, Sarah's 4-year-old daughter was cried out upon only a few weeks after her mother. Though other children would be accused as the panic wore on, Dorothy was the youngest to be arrested in 1692. This innocent child remained in jail until mid-December, when a charitable soul paid for her bail. Like many other young suspects, she does not appear to have ever come to trial, her innocence perhaps shamefully evident in the light of the new year. Her father would later describe Dorothy as so hardly used and terrified by what she had experienced in 1692 that she had no reason to govern herself. Sarah Good remained in prison for a little more than 4 months, surviving off the barest of provisions due to her poverty. When she was finally called before the court of Oyer and Terminer in June, she found herself faced with the old stories and grudges from Salem village. Many were willing to come forward and speak of their misgivings surrounding Sarah Good. Not a single person appears to have spoken in her favor, including her living siblings and husband. Instead, she was forced to experience the degrading treatment of having her poverty and despair explained as witchcraft. Sadly, Sarah Good was found guilty and sentenced to hang on July 19th, along with Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Though we can only construct a general picture of the executions which took place in 1692, certain details have been preserved by contemporary writers. Thanks to the work of Robert Califf, a critic of the Salem Panic, Sarah's final words of defiance have survived. As she stood before the gallows, Reverend Nicholas Noyes, Salem's junior minister, recited a prayer to the gathered assembly. The minister turned to the condemned, imploring one final time that they confess. When her turn came, Reverend Noyes admonished Sarah Good to relent and tell the truth. The courts had proved her a witch, he said, and at the very least she must not go to her death a liar. When she affirmed her innocence once again, he told her he knew she was a witch, and she knew she was a witch. To this, Sarah retorted, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Writing in the 19th century, historian Charles Upham stated that he understood that when Nicholas Noyes passed away in 1717, he had indeed died of an internal hemorrhage, bleeding profusely at the mouth. Though her station in society afforded her a greater degree of protection during the Salem witch trials, we can see another haunting parallel in the story of Ann Dolliver. Born Anne, alternatively Anna, Higginson, in Guilford, Connecticut, circa 1652, this was the daughter of an important family of New England divines. Her father, Reverend John Higginson, was the son of Reverend Francis Higginson, who himself was the son of an English vicar. John had arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony at 13 years old, settling with his family in Salem, where his father organized the first church. It was Reverend Francis Higginson who wrote the Salem Covenant, an essential oath in Puritan theology that constituted an agreement between the settlers and God. Today, the First Church in Salem continues to use the same oath composed by Anne's grandfather nearly 400 years ago. Having resettled to begin his religious career in Connecticut, John Higginson married Sarah Whitefield, daughter of the elder minister of this community. The couple soon had 4 children: John Jr., Nathaniel, Anne, and Sarah. But with circumstances declining in the community, the minister eventually determined to move his family out of Guilford. At the age of about 7, Anne Higginson left her first childhood home with her parents and siblings. In early 1659, the family boarded a ship in Boston, intending to sail for England. However, fate intervened at the start of the voyage, as inclement weather forced the ship to dock, landing in Salem Harbor. Perhaps it seemed divine providence had landed his ship in the very same port where he had arrived with his father 30 years before, for the family would remain in Salem rather than setting off on another ship for England. Upon their arrival, Salem's current minister was in poor health, eventually passing away. By the following spring, John Higginson was offered the position and formally accepted on March 9, 1660. Though life in this bustling seaport must have been quite unlike Guilford, once settled, the day-to-day world of Anne Higginson would likely have been fairly typical for a minister's daughter. The family occupied a home along the perimeter of Salem Common, on the approximate site where the Salem Witch Museum stands today. Though Sarah Higginson gave birth to 3 more sons in Salem, Thomas, Francis, and Henry, she sadly passed away on July 8, 1675. The following year, Anne's only sister, Sarah, died in Boston. At this time, Anne was about 24 years old, unmarried, and probably living at home. As was customary, John Higginson remarried shortly after the death of his first wife, and a stepmother, Mary Blakeman Atwater, joined the Higginson household. At the time of their marriage, John was 59, while Mary was about 38. While Anne's oldest brother, John Higginson Jr., settled in Salem, working as a merchant and later justice of the peace, the rest of the Higginson children soon moved away. Anne, too, eventually departed, for on October 4, 1682, Anne Higginson married William Dolliver. William was the oldest son of the Dolliver family of Gloucester, another early seaside settlement about 16 miles away from Salem. His father, Samuel Dolliver, also spelled Dolliver, seems to have lived in Gloucester since at least 1654, when he purchased a farm on a peninsula known as Freshwater Cove, now known as Dolliver's Neck. At the time of their marriage, William was 26 years old and Anne was about 30. Like Sarah Good, Sarah was slightly older than was usual for a woman's first marriage in the 17th century. Between 1682 and 1688, the couple had 3 children: Sarah, Peter, and Paul. Unfortunately, the marriage seems to have been unhappy from the start. William was employed as a sea captain, described by one source as an improvident one to say the least. As early as 1683, William was complained of in court for idleness and neglecting his family. Though the exact date is unclear, sometime in the late 1680s, William abandoned his wife and children. Where he went is unknown, though John James Babson, a historian of Gloucester, states he probably left the colony entirely. Whatever money Anne had brought into the second marriage seems to have quickly disappeared, as Reverend Higginson later lamented that his daughter had been, quote, "at last totally deserted by her unkind husband, after he had spent all that they had or that I could do for him." Penniless and abandoned, in her mid to late 30s, Ann Dolliver was left with no choice but to return home with her children and live with her father and stepmother. By this time, if not before, Anne appears to have been struggling with her mental health. Her father later described her as overbearingly melancholy and crazed in her understanding. Whether she had always suffered from a malady, one that became more severe with time, or if this illness was a product of her prolonged misfortune, will never be known with certainty. But it is clear her behavior had become noticeably erratic by this stage in her life. Though left with no alternative but to return to her father's home with her children, Anne's timing could not have been worse. Only a few years later, she would find herself living just streets away from the largest series of witch trials in New England's history. Though the initial arrests in 1692 targeted women who were, for one reason or another, social outsiders, accusations quickly escalated beyond what was ordinary. Soon, upper middle class citizens and full church members were targeted as well. On June 6, 1692, Ann Dolliver was accused of committing sundry acts of witchcraft on the bodies of Mary Warren and Susanna Sheldon. The same day, she was arrested and brought before local magistrates Bartholomew Gedney, John Hathorne, and Jonathan Corwin, all members of her father's church. The magistrates began the examination by asking Mistress Dolliver if she had ever practiced witchcraft, to which she replied, not with intent to hurt anybody. What followed was a remarkable string of seemingly honest admissions. Anne stated that she often stayed out in the woods all night, once because of a fainting fit, and on other occasions as she would rather lie in the woods and go around them than come over with the ugly fellow that kept the ferry. She went on to add that her mother also was not pleased with her and that she went from home on that account sometimes. When questioned further, Anne admitted to creating wax poppets. She explained that 14 years ago she had made 2 poppets because she thought she was bewitched and had read in a book that told her that was the way to afflict them that afflicted her. A poppet was a small doll that, when pricked or twisted, was thought to hurt a specific person. This was known as sympathetic magic, essentially the English equivalent of a voodoo doll. While frowned upon by the church, Anne was certainly not alone in her experimentation with folk magic. The transcripts of the Salem trials alone illustrate the widespread use of such practices, particularly when malevolent witchcraft was feared. Despite Anne's confession, no further legal action was taken in her case. Whether she was held in jail for any amount of time or was released immediately is not preserved in the records. Though others had been implicating using far less evidence in 1692, it seems Anne's familial connections had saved her from the horror of imprisonment and injustice of a trial before the court of Oyer and Terminer. Nevertheless, Ann Dolliver's life did not improve in the years after the witchcraft trials. Whatever malady plagued this unfortunate woman appears to have remained incapacitating enough to require the arrangement of some sort of long-term care. At this time, each community was tasked with providing for those who could not sustain themselves. The most common arrangement involved local residents taking in impoverished or sickly individuals and families for a set period of time. The government would compensate these guardians for their care and oversee these constantly shifting living arrangements. As it appears no close family was willing or able to take over her care, Anne was left to the discretion of the Salem selectmen. Though she initially passed between several guardians, Anne was eventually taken in by Sarah and Edward Bishop, 2 more individuals accused of witchcraft in 1692. The couple was among the fortunate few who had managed to escape from prison and evade the corrupt courts until the madness subsided. An interesting choice for the guardians of Salem's distinguished minister, Edward and Sarah had a checkered past in neighboring Beverly, for they had been criticized for running a rowdy, unlicensed tavern. When a neighbor, Christian Trask, confronted them about their behavior, the resulting argument was disturbing enough that Goody Trask became convinced Sarah Bishop had bewitched her. A month later, Christian stabbed herself to death with a pair of sewing scissors. Despite their past, the Bishops would eventually assume the long-term care of Ann Dolliver. In fact, unlike many of these custodial agreements, Anne remained with this family for the remainder of her life. The arrangement would ultimately survive the deaths of both Edward and Sarah Bishop, with their grown sons taking over Anne's care after their parents were gone. Around 1705, the Bishops moved to Rehoboth, a settlement located on the border of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Leaving her children in their grandfather's care, Ann Dolliver moved with the Bishops 70 miles south. As this arrangement was determined at the discretion of the selectmen and bishops, Anne's opinion would have had little bearing on her circumstances. Even if she wished to remain in Salem, close to her children, it would have made little difference once the agreement was reached. Though Anne may have consented to go to Rehoboth, letters preserved by the selectmen indicate that bishops sometimes wished to rid themselves of their troubled charge. However, as Reverend Higginson had arranged for his back pay from Salem to be used for Anne's maintenance fee after his death, the bishops were compensated with a fairly large annual sum, a payment which increased when complaints were filed. Unlike so many other unfortunate souls committed to such arrangements, Anne at the very least seems to have been spared the constant upheaval of being moved from one household to the next because of her family's affluence. What her life was like when the Bishop family in Rehoboth, with the Bishop family in Rehoboth can only be guessed. But despite the occasional complaints of her guardians, the arrangement persisted for the remainder of her life. In all likelihood, she never saw her children or her siblings again. She was still living with this family in 1739 when Salem recorded the reimbursement for boarding and burying Ann Dolliver. Though the exact date of her death is unknown, Ann Dolliver appears to have died in Rehoboth in 1739 at the age of about 87.
The last woman we're going to discuss is Margaret Stephenson Scott, the only person from Rowley, Massachusetts, executed for witchcraft in 1692, although we are aware of 4 other Rowley residents also accused of the crime. Unlike the 3 women we have previously discussed, Margaret's life never seems to have been easy, nor was she ever, apparently, well off. But she did marry and started to raise a family with her husband when she was in her mid-20s. She then found herself widowed by her mid-50s, scapegoated by her neighbors for unfortunate and unexplainable events, and certainly profoundly vulnerable. Detailed information on Margaret's origins and life before the witch trials remains elusive. Margaret Stephenson was born circa 1616 in England to parents who may have been Edward and Margarita Dunn Stevenson. Some online genealogies suggest Scottish roots for either Margaret or her later husband, while others refute that idea. Exactly when the Stevenson family traveled to the New World is unclear, but the first appearance of Margaret is in the Court of Assistants records, which states, "At a small court at Boston, the 28th of the 5th month, 1642, Margaret Stephenson is judged at liberty to be married to Benjamin Scott." Historian Marilyn Roach suggests this statement may have been akin to publishing the banns or announcing a couple's intention to marry, allowing anyone with objections to voice them. Originally a church policy, in colonial Massachusetts, marriages were conducted by magistrates, and so the judgment came from a civil court. Margaret married Benjamin Scott shortly thereafter, and the couple settled in Cambridge. Margaret and Benjamin had 4 children while living in Cambridge: Joseph in 1644, Benjamin in 46, John in 48, and Elizabeth in 50. Elizabeth only lived a few days. Their oldest, Joseph, would die at the age of 20. Sometime before 1651, the family moved to Rowley, Massachusetts, a town about 40 miles north of Cambridge, abutting Ipswich to the south, and about a dozen miles from Salem village. They had 3 more children in Rowley: Mary in 1651, Samuel in 1655, who may have been stillborn, and their last in 1657, Sarah, who died at the age of 3. High infant and child mortality rates were not unusual in 17th-century New England, but losing 3 children so young and outliving their oldest, Joseph died in 1664, must have brought great sorrow to the couple. Once part of Ipswich to the south, Rowley was set off from that town in 1639, named after Rowley, Yorkshire, England. It was led by Puritan minister Ezekiel Rogers, who arrived from the overseas Rowley with about 60 families, most of whom were cloth makers in England, and continued that occupation in the New World. The country's first fulling mill, fulling is a process whereby the threads of newly woven wool are closed together, making the material oil-free, smooth, and ready for use, was established on the Mill River in Rowley in 1643 by Thomas Nelson, and then taken over by John Pearson in 1648 after Nelson died. Pearson is often considered to be the father of the milling industry in America. Perhaps Rowley's industry is what originally brought the Scott family to Rowley. In 1662, Benjamin Scott appears to have sought to purchase some land in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and the deed refers to him as a tailor. Scott was too poor to purchase land in Rowley, it seems, and in 1664 the town gave him a small piece of property. Benjamin Scott died in 1671, leaving Margaret a widow when she was around the age of 55. In his will, dated June 6, 1671, Benjamin says, "As for my outward estate, my will is that my little piece of land the town gave me at the brick kiln, my wife have the benefit of it during her widowhood, so long as she remains relic to me, and after her I will and give it to my son Benjamin. I will also and give unto her my biggest cow and all my household stuff. I give her to be wholly her own." Benjamin Sr. went on to give his son Benjamin most of his other livestock and his land after his mother's use, other livestock to son John and daughter Mary, and went on to stipulate, as regarded the land, further, that my son Benjamin and John, according to his promise, to be helpful in the getting up of a house on the land for the comfort of their mother. The Rowley House today, known as the Benjamin Scott House and thought to have been built in 1676, may have been the one Benjamin Jr. and brother John constructed for his mother, per his father's wishes 5 years earlier. It has been significantly renovated over the years. What Margaret's 20-plus years of life as a widow were like is unknown. At his death, the value of Benjamin Scott Sr.'s estate was £67, 17 shillings, a pittance to sustain a single woman for 2 decades. How helpful her children were is also unknown. We only have the accusations of her Rowley neighbors to give us a sketchy portrait of her activities and character. As mentioned earlier, Margaret was one of 5 people known to have been accused of witchcraft in Rowley. 3 men were complained against in late August and arrested at the same time. John Howard, a hired man who swept the meeting house, and John Jackson Sr. and John Jackson Jr., brother and nephew of Elizabeth Jackson Howe of Ipswich, who had been executed for witchcraft a month earlier. The accusations against the 3 were lodged by Ephraim Foster Vandover and Joseph Tyler of Boxford, claiming afflictions against daughter Rose Foster and stepsister Martha Sprague, respectively. How John Howard was caught up in the affair is unclear. The only other Rowley woman accused was Mary Post. She was tried and convicted, but was eventually reprieved. As for Margaret Scott, the accusations of witchcraft against her came almost entirely from 2 neighboring families, the Wickhams and the Nelsons, and 1 servant. On August 4th, 19-year-old Mary Daniel, possibly the servant of Rowley Reverend Edward Payson, told of multiple spectral visits from the widow Scott over the preceding weeks. Mary said she was taken ill, pinched, and afflicted by this apparition, and that the soles of her feet were pricked. On another occasion, Scott's specter pulled Mary backwards in her chair, pinched her, and rendered her speechless. One night, Scott's specter was accompanied by Goodwife Jackson, said Mary. Who this was is not clear. Could it have been the already executed Elizabeth Jackson Howe, formerly of Rowley? Margaret Scott was arrested within a week after Mary Daniel's claims. Mary was supported in her accusations against Widow Scott by Mary Warren and Elizabeth Hubbard from Salem Village, who, like Daniel, were household servants. Under oath, they both affirmed that they saw Margaret Scott afflict Mary Daniel when they were questioned at the grand jury hearing on September 15th. They both claimed Scott hurt them as well. While many of the original examination notes regarding Widow Scott are missing, we can still read the grand jury records from September 15th, where Scott was indicted for afflicting Mary Daniel, as well as for afflicting Frances Wickham, the daughter of Rowley luminary Captain Daniel Wickham. In mid-April, deposed Frances, she started experiencing afflictions and was choked by Margaret Scott, although whether it was Widow Scott in the flesh or her specter, she could not be sure. Wickham's afflictions continued into August. Again, because of the sparse evidence, it's not clear if Wickham complained about her torments in April or if she only gave details when she was deposed in September. Frances's father, Captain Wickham, also gave evidence to the grand jury, telling of a peculiar incident 5 or 6 years prior, when Margaret came to his door asking to glean or gather the remains of corn from his field. Captain Wickham asked her to wait until he had gathered the corn he wanted for himself, to which she replied he would not be able to get the corn out of the field that night. Captain Wickham testified that when he brought his cart and oxen into the field after her departure and loaded the cart with corn, the oxen refused to budge. The following day, the cart moved with ease. He was convinced it was an act of witchcraft. The other neighboring family who feared Widow Scott were the Nelsons. Sergeant Thomas Nelson, whose father, Thomas Nelson Sr., was one of Rowley's original founders and established that first fulling mill, as mentioned earlier, deposed that 6 years prior, Margaret asked him for wood several times. Nelson offered to bring her some wood in exchange for 10 shillings he owed her, which she declined. After he delayed delivering any wood to her, 2 of his cattle died in strange circumstances. I do verily believe that she is a witch, said Nelson. Philip Nelson, later a justice of the peace in Essex County, and his wife Sarah, also recounted the story of Robert Chiletto, who had often told them Widow Scott was a witch and was making him ill. He had since died. On September 17th, Margaret Scott was found guilty by the Court of Oyer and Terminer and sentenced to hang. On the 22nd, she and 7 others, Martha Corey, Mary Eastie, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Ann Pudiator, Wilmot Red, and Samuel Wardwell, were executed on Proctor's Ledge. When all 8 were dead, Reverend Nicholas Noyes was quoted as saying, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." While it is unknown where Margaret Scott's remains lie, it is possible, like other innocent victims of the Salem witch trials, that a family member may have retrieved her body from the site to bury at home. Unlike other families who soon were petitioning for restitution and reversal of attainders for their loved ones, meaning the nullification of their conviction, clearing of their name, and return of their civil rights, Margaret's family was apparently silent. She remained a convicted witch for close to 300 years. It was not until 2001 that the names of 5 victims, Bridget Bishop, Susanna Martin, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott, were formally cleared by a legislative act in the Boston State House. That last list is very interesting. We know quite a bit about Bishop and Martin. The latter, we know, had quite a few children. Where were they when families were petitioning? It's a mystery. Today, there's quite a lot of interest from descendants of both women. We know almost nothing about Parker and Red and think there may have been no direct descendants of either. It's not surprising that there was little vocal support from these 2 families after their deaths, nor is there much descendant inquiry. Descendants of Margaret Scott, on the other hand, are among the most active of all the descendants we meet. We know very little about her. The surviving children were few, and yet this is a very engaged and knowledgeable group. To share a little anecdote about the descendant packets that we've been offering for about 6 years now, I tackled Margaret's story in the fall of 2019, and the first version was ready just before COVID struck in March of 2020. While the museum was shut down for those first months, only the newly created descendant packets were available on our online store, and Rachel was part of the skeleton crew still working. She filled the first orders. At the same time, I took the opportunity to do some field research in Rowley. I will never forget wandering around the Rowley burying ground, not a soul in sight, and finding the gravestones of 2 of Margaret's accusers, as well as the gravestone of her daughter-in-law, Susanna Scale Scott. You can see photos of these on our 1692 online sites tour on our website. So we were back to work by June. Soon thereafter, I heard from a Scott descendant who pointed out I had combined 2 Benjamin Scott families in the biography, one from Cambridge and one from Braintree. It was so helpful, I immediately revised the biography. Then a Canadian gentleman, a 10th great grandson of the Scotts, who had done a lot of family research, called to let me know the intriguing fact that Benjamin Scott was himself descended from Reginald Scott, author of the famous 1584 book, The Discovery of Witchcraft, in which he sought to debunk the belief in magic and witchcraft. I added this fascinating fact to the bio. And then in January of 2023, on an episode of Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr., it was revealed that actress Claire Danes is a descendant of Margaret Scott. Another addition. So I would like to say sincere thanks to everyone who has reached out to add or change or clarify information in any of our packets or on the online site store. It is greatly appreciated.
So that is the talk we have prepared today. We do have some time for questions. If anybody has them, please feel free to pop them in the chat. So I do see a question that came in to the Q&A during the presentation talking about the slide. Here, we can even go back to that slide. When we were talking about Rachel Clinton, this is a very famous illustration. It does not specifically depict Rachel Clinton. It's called Arresting a Witch. And there is a man holding a staff. I believe that's a constable's staff
Right.
from the 17th century.
Right.
So that was something that distinguished men as the constable
The law.
of the moment.
Yeah. And it's Pyle, very famous illustrator, Pyle, Howard Pyle, a great illustrator.
So we have a question. What books would you recommend for someone who wants to learn more about witchcraft in Salem and in general?
Witchcraft meaning the Salem trials, not modern witchcraft, right? Yeah, so there's several on our website. There's Day by Day Chronicle by Marilyn Roach and Six Women by Marilyn Roach, Storm of Witchcraft by Emerson Baker.
In the Devil's Snare.
In the Devil's Snare, Mary Beth Norton. There's quite a few. We carry a lot of them in the store and online. And it's down the rabbit hole you'll go. Once you start, you'll be looking into it for years.
So we have another question. Why wouldn't Margaret's son Benjamin have defended her? Fear of being accused himself?
So we don't know. We don't know what was happening with the families. Susanna Martin is always the biggest mystery to me. So I believe she had 8 children. I think they were all living. We don't know why some families really went and pleaded for the clearing of the names, and others were silent. We need a time machine to go back and figure it out.
When you say fear of being accused himself, that is certainly possible. We know that that was a very real,
a shameful time, but
unfortunately, it's one of many possibilities.
Yeah.
So there's a question, will there be a written transcript of this talk? There will not be a written transcript made available, but the program has been recorded and it will be added to our website, so you'll be able to watch it again at your leisure. I would expect the recording will go up by Monday at the latest. We have another comment that says, I have seen reports that Margaret may have been homeless at points. Is there any truth to that which we know of?
So because she was begging door to door, she certainly wasn't in a good place. But I think, now having seen the will that her husband said, you have to help your mother get a house up on this property, I think she would have been living there. But again, it's very sketchy, the records for her. And just like Rachel Clinton, I not that I loved it, but the idea that she was given this little hut out on Hog Island that was Benjamin Proctor's property was very not romantic exactly, but oh, how interesting. And then someone says that's absolutely not true and there's nothing in the records. So again, sketchy ideas of where these poor folks ended up living out their lives.
It does kind of connect for me in a way. We know that there are a couple of marriages that happen after the Salem witch trials between families of people impacted. Most famously, or I don't know, most kind of poignantly, Sarah Wild's widower and George Jacobs' widow. So the people who had lost their spouses as executed victims marrying each other afterwards, so you do kind of think about people finding each other in the aftermath and helping each other. Okay, so we have um, um, being a Rebecca Nurse descendant, learning that I'm a descendant of Margaret really made it hit home that status in life means nothing in this hysteria, certainly. Are any of Margaret Scott's descendants living in the Raleigh area?
So I said at the beginning that that I met a couple this week who had just learned that she was a descendant of Margaret Scott, and they live in Haverhill. And so I think sure there are people around who still live in the area.
So I see another question that says you mentioned Christian Trask since she committed suicide, but she was buried in a churchyard. I found that strange. Was that common for the time? I'm not sure where Christian Trask was buried. Do you know that off the
I
top of
don't
your head? Yeah.
know it either.
Yeah, I know that. So what we quoted when we were talking about Sarah Good's father, the law of the time is that a person who committed suicide was supposed to have, like they weren't buried with great reverence, right? Like I don't remember what the exact quote is, but they're marked with stones on the side of a common highway or something along those lines. So I would imagine that's how she's treated, but I'm not sure specifically where she is buried.
And like Giles Corey,
Yeah.
his sort of refusing to go along with the court and taking that pressing and dying was considered suicide by many, and he supposedly was buried at a crossing in what is Peabody today. That I'm thinking maybe is one of those places where it's outside the normal burying ground.
So I see another comment talking about Sarah Good. The quote about blood to drink was direct quote. Yeah, so that is, we don't have many direct quotes from especially the women, but there are a couple of lines that really just stick with you, and it's about as much of a direct quote as it can be from her. It's from a critic of the trials, so it seems likely that that really was said at
And
her
what a great
at
quote.
her
I mean,
execution. Yeah,
he was tough.
she was tough. Yeah, it was almost as we obviously picking these four women knew there were many similarities between them, but as you could tell, Jill researched and wrote the section about Rachel Clinton. I researched and wrote the section about Sarah Good, and as we're putting them together, we were really kind of shocked by how
How
close their
similar,
stories
yeah.
were.
And it's like it's male figures cheating them out of their inheritance. It comes into it
Yeah.
frequently. These terrible stories.
And it does show how Ann Dolliver, for example, had protection from the men in her life, and her story ends very differently than the other women. So it really speaks to women's vulnerability during that time. So we also have a question, why was Proctor's Ledge selected for the hangings?
So at the time, it was the edge of town, and it wasn't as tree filled as it is today, and it was a place that is low down on what is called Gallows Hill now. It was a ledge that I think people would be able to see it from a distance. It was some kind of, don't let this happen to you in a way. And it's called Proctor's Ledge today because later a member of the Proctor family owned that land.
Yeah, it was
It
not
was
called
not called that then.
Yeah. So writing a little bit closer to the events, but still quite a ways away, John Adams notes in his diary in like the mid 18th century going to the site where the hangings happened, and he called it Witchcraft Hill. So, it's not called Proctor's Ledge for quite a while. Um, all right. Well, it looks like there are no more questions in the chat. So thank you all so much for joining us for this Women's History Month event. Please do follow us on social media. It's the best way to keep up with what's going on here at the Salem Witch Museum. We always have new things happening here. We had some new artifacts we added into our exhibit last year. We have some big plans coming up next year. So please follow us at Salem Witch Museum on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And we hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Happy Women's History Month to everyone.